Starting off at number 5, Collat. Collat is a Polish horror game released in 2015 and is the most directly inspired by real events of any of the games on this list, putting you in the shoes of an explorer setting out to uncover the truth and close the case on the Dilatov Pass incident, a mystery that's plagued and terrified people for 60 years. 9 Russian college students disappeared under incredibly mysterious circumstances in the winter while trekking out in the mountains. This is of course based on the real-life Dilatov Pass incident where this exact thing happened. A group of friends went out for a trek in the mountains, and after no word was heard from the group for nearly a month, a search party set out, and after months and months of searching the mountains, eventually police found the remains of the hikers. 6 had passed from hypothermia, and 3 of them had horrific internal injuries. It's a very famous case, and I invite you to read about it after this video because it is fascinating and terrifying, and no one had gotten to the bottom of it, so it seemed like a good setting for a survival horror mystery game that's also narrated by Sean Bean for some reason. Yeah, Sean Bean narrates this one. I don't know why, but because he's the narrator, he can't die, so he's got that going for him. While the most common hypothesis is that the group suffered under an avalanche, the game offers a much more complex narrative than that, featuring a bit of government conspiracy, supernatural dealings, and all the usual checklist stuff you'd expect from an indie Steam horror game. I've never actually played it, so I can't comment on it too much. I did watch the trailer, looks pretty cool, but I like to throw in one indie game in these lists that nobody's ever heard of. Check Collat out, go give it a shot. And if you're enjoying all the content we're putting out, first of all, thank you very much. But might I suggest subscribing or clicking through for loads more horror content? We got loads of videos and we love the clicks. Let's keep going. Number 4, Outlast. Nothing is scarier than being alone in a dark hospital at night. And it's made even worse when all the patients are deranged and violent from years of government-sanctioned brainwashing. That's Outlast. If you haven't played Outlast, you play as an intrepid journalist who goes off to investigate an asylum after an anonymous whistleblower sends you a tip to go check it all out because something freaky is happening up there. So you do, and in classic horror video game guy fashion, you only bring a camera with you and nothing else, and don't even tell anyone you're going. You barely even bring batteries. You discover that the asylum has gone downhill, to say the least, and the inmates are running the asylum and are all too far gone to even know what's happening anymore, and are all violently hostile to outsiders. We learn as we venture through the halls that all the inmates have been experimented on by a cruel corporation trying to research the usual super soldier stuff, using all sorts of immoral research to try and activate extrasensory powers on people. Now, of course, Outlast does get pretty fantastical and horrifying, and I don't want to spoil too much, but eventually you are, like, running away from ghosts and psychic conscious monsters, which, as far as I know, doesn't exist. But the horrors of Outlast, the really scary stuff, isn't the bloody patients or monsters, it's the fact that they were experimented on by questionable government scientists for the ridiculous purpose of creating psychic super soldiers. Which would sound like a video game plot if it wasn't for the CIA's MKUltra, Montauk, and Project Gateway programs, which are all very real, very documented instances when the CIA tried to research how possible it was to make someone psychic. Look this up when this video is done, okay? The infamous projects have served as the inspiration for a few things, with Montauk and MKUltra directly inspiring the Netflix series Stranger Things. Sometimes the strangest things are the things that really happen. But the strangest thing about Outlast? Why does your guy never try to fight back, even once? He only has the camera, I get that, but he's not even gonna try picking up a pipe or something. He's got feet, he's got hands, I don't know, I'm still bothered about this, we gotta move on. Number 3, Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl. Well, given the title of the game, I bet if you really think about it, you can probably imagine what true event Stalker is based on. But if you're not a fan of GSC's ultra brutal apocalypse RPG horror series, Stalker, which is an acronym for Scavengers, Trespassers, Adventurers, and I honestly can't remember the rest. Anyway, you play a stalker, someone who traverses the hostile irradiated hellscape known as the Zone, the surrounding areas around Chernobyl, which have become host to all sorts of threats from zombies, mutants, bandits, and radiation. It paints a pretty grim scenario. In the world of Stalker, the Chernobyl incident occurred the same way it did in our real world. Mismanagement and improperly constructed equipment led to a disastrous accident that irradiated the surrounding area, causing everyone to evacuate and causing a state of emergency. Where the timelines differ is that in Stalker, after this accident, some secret Soviet scientists go back to Chernobyl to use it as a lab to conduct all sorts of nefarious experiments that eventually lead to a collapse in reality, tearing open some holes, anomalies everywhere, an even bigger disaster, letting loose all manner of monster and mutant onto the surrounding areas, such as life in the zone. Obviously, things didn't get this bad in the real world, and as far as I know, there's no bloodsuckers lurking in Pripyat. I've never been, but you know, I've heard. But the real Chernobyl incident was about as horrifyingly close to a full-on apocalyptic incident as we've ever come. Interestingly too, as another little Stalker tidbit, Stalker is very loosely inspired by a piece of classic Russian cinema. Unless you've got a Criterion Channel subscription, maybe you didn't know this, but the 1979 film Stalker, which is set in a hostile, strange environment where the laws of physics no longer apply, is led by scavengers who hunt through the strange land called the Zone. There's not a lot of post-apocalyptic mercenaries fighting zombies, and mostly it's just kind of esoteric musings. It's loosely inspired, but it's still very much worth noting if you're a big fan of grim dystopian European media, and if you like Stalker, you'll probably like the other Stalker. Moving on. Number 2. Fatal Frame. Fatal Frame was a series of survival horror games that put the player in control of various investigators in 1980s Japan, revolving around taking photos to find ghosts, plain and simple. The games are downright horrifying, with the developer's original intended mission statement being to make the scariest game possible, and there's quite a few fans who would agree with that. Although there's been a bunch of Fatal Frame games, the one we're going to be taking a look at is the very first. The first game in the series was largely inspired by a real Japanese urban legend ghost story, The Legend of Himuro Mansion. The story goes that a long time ago, a family lived in Himuro Mansion who participated in a strange ritual called the Strangling Ritual, which would seal off bad energy from within the earth. The family would choose a maiden, isolate her from the rest of the world to not attach her to the earth at all, thinking that this was part of the ritual if she got too connected to the material world. On the day of the ritual, she was bound by ropes and attached to horses, and you honestly don't want to know what comes next. The last ritual performed by the family ran into a bit of a hitch when the maiden fell in love with a man who tried to save her, leading to the patriarch of the family raising his blade to the maiden, then on his own family, then himself. The story goes that if you take a photo of the Himuro Mansion, you're able to see a ghost in the frame, which is what directly inspired the main gameplay mechanic of Fatal Frame, taking photos of ghosts. Now, I wouldn't feel super right if I didn't mention the tagline that boasts that Fatal Frame is based on a true story was only ever included in the North American release of the game, not the Japanese or European ones. So either it is inspired by this urban legend, or that was just something they put on the box to sell a cool game. Either way, Fatal Frame rules, and that's really all there is to it. And number 1, Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil has always been one of my all-time favorite series, and Resident Evil Village was like a kiss from Capcom on the cheek as a longtime fan. It was like RE4 and RE7 had a beautiful baby. It's probably the most out there the series has ever got, trading out the usual zombies and tentacle monsters for fairy tale horrors, werewolves, ogres, and a very tall vampire who I'm pretty sure at least 50% of the audience already knows a lot about. But as fantastical as Resident Evil Village is, did you know how much of it was inspired on reality? Yeah, well, okay, somewhat. First and foremost, the infamous Castle Dimitrescu was directly inspired by a real castle in the Carpathians where the game is set, Castle Pelish. If you look at some comparison images, it is like the spitting image down to the layout of the interior of the castle. Make sure to check those drawers for red herbs and ammo if you're ever passing through. Well, what about the lady of the manor, Miss Lady Dimitrescu herself? Well, tragically, there aren't any 9-foot tall vampire women, and if there are, call me. Art director Tomonoro Takano shed a bit of light on the inspiration for the very infamous lady. Her impressive stature is based on a Japanese urban legend called Hachisu Hakasama, an 8-foot tall woman with long black hair wearing a long white dress and a big brimmed hat. The Hachisu Hakasama lures men away by imitating the voices of their loved ones. While Dimitrescu never lures Ethan away this way, she does hold his baby hostage, so she's got the holding your loved ones thing down pat. But this urban legend wasn't the only inspiration for the lady of the manor. Dimitrescu is inspired directly by Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian countess of infamous renown, who was thought to be an occultist, a vampire, a demon, or something evil. Bathory was legendarily cruel, and would take great pleasure in the pain she inflicted on her victims. She allegedly would bathe in blood from the peasant girls she'd abducted, and would bite them and subject them to unbelievable cruelty. Lady Dimitrescu's castle features a massive bathtub of blood directly inspired by this legend, not to mention the medieval torture cellar she keeps down below in the basement. Lady Bathory never had claws or a second form in her boss fight, but she was undeniably one of the scariest women to ever live. And sometimes the truth is way scarier than the fictions. Number 5. Left 4 Dead 2. Up first on our list is Left 4 Dead 2, the sequel to Valve's 2008 smash hit Left 4 Dead. Left 4 Dead 2 changed the game entirely, revolutionizing the zombie genre and reinventing everything you knew about Left 4 Dead by taking the exact same game and setting it in Louisiana instead of Pennsylvania. Now the actual game is amazing. I could hark sweet nothings about Left 4 Dead all day. The 4-player co-op zombie survival game was some of the most fun you could have with an internet connection back in the day. I probably lost hundreds of hours of my 8th grade playing Left 4 Dead 2. But if you happen to live somewhere like Australia or Germany, you wouldn't been able to have played Left 4 Dead 2 at all, since because of its intense depictions of violence, the game was deemed too heinously gory to be sold, classifying it as too violent to be sold as an MA-15 game, the highest rating Australia had at the time. Valve tried to fight back against the classification as much as they could, insisting that all the violence depicted in the game was against zombies, who are no longer human. They just look like humans and fall apart pretty easily. The workaround? Valve released a heavily censored release of Left 4 Dead 2 for international markets, which removes just about everything yucky. No missing limbs, no guts, gore, blood, and piles of bodies are all gone out of the Australian release. Oddly, and possibly as an apology for removing content, the German release of Left 4 Dead 2 also heavily censored all the violence, features weaponry not available in any other releases of the game, all ported over from Counter-Strike's source. Pretty funny to note as well, the cover art for Left 4 Dead 2 is a severed hand missing a couple fingers, with 2 fingers held up to denote that it's Left 4 Dead 2, like this. Well, because that gesture is considered rude in England, the cover was replaced there with a variant where the hand is facing backwards. And hey, on the off chance anybody from Valve's watching, if you guys wouldn't mind, I really would like another Left 4 Dead. Don't forget to subscribe for more horror content coming your way every day. Number 4. Silent Hill Homecoming. Silent Hill has always been one of the most terrifying video game series on the planet. When you think of the hulking pyramid head or any of the other flesh monstrosities that wander the restless dreams of that town, Silent Hill has always been good at making your hair stand on end. Silent Hill Homecoming was the 5th Silent Hill released, and the first by a studio that wasn't Team Silent. The player is put into the boots of Alex Shepard, a Spec Ops combat veteran returning to his hometown, not of Silent Hill, but its neighboring town of Shepherd's Glen. It's a homecoming, if you will. Now the actual game is okay. I'm too close to Silent Hill to speak about the series fairly. I wouldn't say it's the scariest Silent Hill, and it's not the best, but it's also not the worst. It's kind of just right in the middle. But it's the only game in the series that was ever outright banned. The game contains some pretty intense violence, probably the goriest entry in the series, I would say. A scene in particular depicts our hero Alex struggling against a cultist enemy, and if Alex fails the event, Alex gets a drill into him violently, and if he succeeds, the cultist gets the drill, so either way, somebody is losing bad. And that someone is the nations of Australia, Germany, and Japan, as the game was refused classification for Australia and Germany, and speaking of which, those two are going to come up a lot on this list, as they really do not like violence in their games. Japan is a little more confusing, as I couldn't find why the game was never sold in Japan. Violence doesn't usually tend to get a game banned in Japan, so it's unknown why it was never available there. But to our Japanese viewers, I gotta say, you're really not missing out on too much. Don't worry. Number 3. Agony. Agony, 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 agony. I was working at a video game store when this one came out, and boy do I remember the controversy around it. Our store only got a single copy of the game. Agony was a 2018 survival horror game that set out on a mission to be the most disgusting game ever released, and in a lot of ways, they achieved that. Agony follows the story of a lost soul condemned to hell with no memory of their former life, and like anyone who'd be trapped in hell, are trying fruitlessly to escape. Agony's main selling point was its intense depiction of hell, overflowing with blood, gore, fire, and brimstone. Agony is pretty much non-stop gooey gore from the second the game starts. The game was actually heavily censored before even being released, as initial ratings of Agony received the infamous adults only rating, which would have prevented it from being sold in major retailers or online platforms. So the final product had to be heavily edited just to even meet the M17 rating, the highest rating the ESRB gives out. I feel like it's worth throwing this out there if you're hearing about this and you think that I made Agony sound kinda cool and you want to check the game out. I'll let you know that the controversy seems like it was more a marketing thing, because the actual game is kind of bad. For all its overwhelming gore, it gets really dull fast. You know, you walk into one room full of nightmarish, incomprehensible walls of 1,000 wretched faces screaming and crying blood, and really, you've seen them all, you know? The game gets pretty samey really fast, and the actual gameplay is really dull despite its environments. After its release, it became clear that Agony was nothing more than a maypole for controversy. Number 2. Condemned: Criminal Origins. Condemned: Criminal Origins was a launch title for the Xbox 360 all the way back in 2005. so I wouldn't be surprised if you forgot about it. It was a first-person survival horror game where you played a detective built like a linebacker, hunting a serial murderer on the trail of a series of condemned buildings, obviously, all the while being attacked by populations of the city who have all gone violently mad by some mysterious force. Now, Condemned is probably the scariest game on this list, and I'd go so far as to say it's one of the scariest games I've ever played in my life. Drawing major inspiration from films like Seven, Silence of the Lambs, and Saw, Condemned is the kind of game that makes you feel like you'd need to take a boiling shower afterwards and scrub yourself. The game is entirely in a first-person perspective, and you really feel like you are knee-deep in the filthy grime of the city. So what banned Condemned? Well, in Germany, the game was refused to be sold because of a law stating that any depictions of cruel or otherwise inhuman acts of violence against human beings in a manner which expresses a glorification, which really could describe any of the video games I listed today. Interestingly, unlike a lot of the other ones on this list, Condemned was actually banned after it was released, not before. Its sequel, Condemned Bloodshot, was also banned for the exact same reasons. Now, for what it's worth, Condemned is pretty vile and pretty scary. It's a testament to how disturbing the game is in its depictions of horror, foregoing supernatural elements and trying to depict the situation as realistically as possible. You do have to admit, it is kind of ironic too, that when you think about it, the game itself was condemned. Still, nonetheless, if you're feeling brave enough for it, I would recommend checking it out. It is horrifying. Number 1. Manhunt. There could not have been any other game at number 1 on the list about banned horror video games. If you're passionate about horror games and you know your horror game history, you were probably already expecting for Manhunt to show up. When you really think about it, Manhunt is probably one of the most infamous video games ever released. Manhunt comes to us from Rockstar Games, who are definitely no stranger to controversy, being the developers behind Grand Theft Auto. If anything, they welcome controversy, even going so far as in the early days paying for bad reviews for the GTA games to make them seem cooler. A contraband video game? What kid wouldn't want that? Well, Manhunt was a similar situation. Almost all of Rockstar's games see you playing a criminal of some kind, be it a thug, an outlaw, or a high school bully. But Manhunt has you playing as a death row inmate who is kidnapped by a sick benefactor known as the Director, who communicates to you through an earpiece, and in exchange for your freedom, wants to watch you take out members of various gangs across the city while he watches you on hijacked CCTV cameras for his sick pleasure. As the player fights off depraved gangsters, criminals, and one particularly memorable delusional chainsaw-wielding naked pig mask-wearing psychopath, you'll find yourself caught in a grisly web. Now, video game violence has always been a very touchy subject. What is too realistic? Where is the line? Manhunt very intentionally walked that line. A quote from ex-Rockstar developer Jeff Williams, who contributed to Manhunt, had this to say: "The game just made us all feel icky. It was all about the violence, and it was about realistic violence. We all knew there was no way we could explain away this game. We all knew we were crossing a line. There was almost a mutiny in the staff over it." A Manhunt sees the player executing people for the pleasure of the Director, all using household objects and disturbingly realistic depictions of violence. Infamously, Manhunt was involved in a real-life tragic death, with the assailant having been purported to have been obsessed with the game by friends, which led to efforts to have the game banned outright from stores. In New Zealand, owning Manhunt was actually considered a criminal charge. You could get charged for having this video game in your home. The province of Ontario restricted Manhunt to the dreaded AO rating, pulling it from store shelves. Despite the intense nature of the game and the controversy surrounding it, Manhunt went on to be a cult classic. It sold well, it wasn't banned as widespread as Rockstar had feared, and to this day, it still even has its fans. It sold and reviewed well enough to even get a sequel, which very, very bizarrely was exclusive to the Nintendo Wii, a console exclusively known for its family-friendly entertainment. Nothing more family-friendly than Manhunt.
Coming in at number 5, we have Rule of Rose. The Rule of Roses came out on PS2 in 2006. Rule of Roses is a survival horror game. It was set in England in 1930. You play as a 19-year-old woman who becomes trapped in a world ruled by young girls who have established their own hierarchy and rules. It is seen as a dark and twisted game. Before it was even released, it was banned in many countries due to topics it touches on. This means it was already seen as a mystery to the public and made them want to play it even more. It is said meant to push you psychologically as you explore an old orphanage. When the game was released, the talk around the game only grew. As the first few gamers got their hands on the new release, it appeared to not be a fun experience. This game did fly under the radar slightly as it was released on PS2 shortly after the release of the PS3, meaning many people had already moved on to their new console and were not playing new releases for the previous gen. There was a couple of deaths related to the game. It was reported that they were scared to death. Although the official report is heart attack induced by stress, these deaths could be completely coincidental. However, it does seem highly suspicious that these players were on the game at the time that they passed away. The game pushed them to such fear and stress that their hearts simply gave out. Whether it is a major coincidence or the game is truly cursed, I would say that it is not worth finding out. Coming in at number 4, we have Momo. The Blue Whale / Momo game is less of a video game you start playing and more of a real-life social media game. It started in 2019, mostly in Russia. It is believed that the game was started on Facebook. There are a group of admins who use the page to give daily tasks to its members. The members are given daily tasks to complete over 50 days. It is unclear why the players keep playing. There is no clear incentive or prize that they will receive. For this reason, it is believed that those who play become cursed. This curse drives them crazy. They get paranoid, feeling like they're being followed. They believe that by finishing the game they would be saved from the curse. That once they completed the final task, they would finally be free. Unfortunately, that is not the case. On the 50th day, what seems to have happened with a number of players is that they post the blue whale on their Instagram account before taking their own life. This blue whale is the biggest indicator that they have been playing the game. The people who run the game seem to be able to manipulate the players to do whatever it is they want them to. The police were unable to get to the bottom of who was running the game. This again made people believe it may have been an entity, something that used this technology to spread its curse and seep into those people's lives to do what they need them to do, then dispose of them when they're done. There hasn't been much talk of the game in some years. The more the game was talked about and information was spread, the less people fell for playing the game. Most people these days are aware of the game, so it cannot take any more victims. If you do stumble across the game, do not join the group. It is believed once you complete the first task, there is no way out. Coming in at number 3, we have Pokemon 1996. In 1996, Pokemon created a version for portable consoles. It was the first version of Pokemon on Game Boy. Shortly after its launch, Japan had to look into some terrifying concerns. In the summer that the game was released, self-death rates between 6 to 12-year-olds shot up drastically. When looking into this, it appeared they all had one thing in common: they all owned the Pokemon game. They had all become addicted to the game, as is usually the case with such a huge launch. There was one dark location within the game that seemed to be the cause for the problem. The area name was Lavender Town, which was hidden away within the game. This town was created as the eternal resting place for the deceased. You could walk around the ghost town and visit the graveyard. It was not just visiting the town that was the problem, it was reportedly the music. The Japanese version has a terrifying soundtrack to this town, which was reportedly chilling and caused strange effects on players. Players would feel irritable, accompanied by insomnia. An investigation into the deaths was launched. They found that they all had one thing in common: their last game was saved in Pueblo Lavender. After the investigation, they had to pull the game in all the locations. They changed the music as they decided that this was most likely the cause of the disturbing events. The company who developed the game was looked into, and they had kept a list of all the children affected by the game, evidence that they knew what was going on long before it became so tragic. It would be hard to get your hands on the original version of the game, but if you do consider playing it, maybe play it on mute. In at number 2, we have Berserk. In 1980, Stern Electronics released the game Berserk. It was brought on in arcade versions and for Atari 2600. The game was known to be one of the first shooter games of all time. The game was capitalizing on the hype around robots at the time. The premise of the game is to kill the robots and try to escape for the facility. If you took too long in any section, Evil Otto will come to get you. Once released, it did not take long for claims to rise that the game had killed players. It might seem unlikely, but these deaths were confirmed. The first victim was 17-year-old Jeff Daly. He was playing the game at the arcade with his friends when he spent hours on Berserk to try and beat his top score. He finally beat it and reached 16,660 points. The minute the score went through the system, he suffered a heart attack and passed away. A few weeks later, there was an 18-year-old boy, Peter Pekowski, who had the exact same thing happen to him. Neither boys had previous health conditions. This caused a panic around the game. The media began to look into it and report on what was happening. A coroner did an autopsy on both bodies and created a report for the media on what might have happened. England. He said he could confirm they previously had no conditions. What he thinks happened was the stress of the game was too intense for these young boys to handle. He reported that the stress triggered a heart attack. There had been more deaths reported in relation to the game, but none have been looked into like those of the first two victims. There are no reports of the arcade or Atari versions being pulled. If you did manage to get your hands on a copy and play it today, you would have to be careful. Getting this high score is not worth your life. And finally, in at number 1 we have Taboo, The Sixth Sense. Taboo was released by Nintendo in 1989 for the Nintendo Entertainment System. The game was for tarot reading. You would simply input your name and date of birth and then ask about your future. You would then receive a usual tarot reading after it draws your chosen cards. The game had a lot of symbols of religion and even nudity, things that would not get approved in a game today. They expected this game to be family friendly, that you could enjoy with everyone, but many people became disturbed by the game and what it would tell them. Parents began to feel it was not safe for their children to be playing with games like this. Particularly disturbing was the game predicting the death of a few young players. It predicted their tragic deaths at their young age. The myth is that soon after it was predicted, a number of the predictions came true. Many players took the game seriously and believed that it could in fact tell the future. The manual of the game read, "We are not responsible for what may happen when Taboo or any effect, influence or miracle that may occur in the relation to the game." The mystery of Taboo confirmed that the game announced the death of some young people, who therefore supposedly died. Nintendo did not want the talk around this game to continue. They decided to permanently remove the game from its catalogue and pull it from its shelves. Of course, no matter how much they tried to bury the game, there are still copies out there and people who remember playing the game. If you do get your hands on a copy, please be careful. Once you know how you will die, there is nothing you can do to change your fate.